Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to talk a little about trench warfare. Trench warfare is the resulting type of fighting that we see with the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan, if you recall, was the idea that Germany here could go through Belgium and Luxembourg and catch France by surprise, thereby ending the war quickly and efficiently. This does not work, and Alfred von Schlieffen is labeled as something of a failure because of it. When the Belgian army actually fights back and the Germans are unable to get around France in time, they have to do what's known as trench warfare. This involves digging massive holes in the ground and having your army stand in that hole and fire at its enemy. Both sides end up doing this, and you get a trench line that cuts through Europe like this. Now, trench warfare is a particularly slow way to fight. It takes a long time to dig the trench, it takes a long time to take the enemy trench, it takes a long time to do anything. It's not fast and not the best way to fight. Now, to make your trench, one of the first things you're going to need is a shovel. If you're lucky enough to have some of these tools, that's great. If not, you're going to have to use whatever you've got. Your hands, your spoons, your helmets, pieces of wood, anything you can find to dig down into the ground. You'll need some barbed wire. Protect yourselves. This covers a lot of the no man's land in the section around the trenches. You also need sand to fill sandbags to protect yourselves, but I didn't know how to draw that, so you'll just have to trust me on it. When you're done, you're going to end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Your sandbags here and here are going to protect you from enemy fire. You dig down about 2 meters and you have about 1.5 meters clearance at the top where it narrows down at the bottom. If you're lucky, you have what are known as duck boards, like down here. This keeps you from standing in the mud and the water that inevitably builds up at the bottom of the trench. Most trenches didn't have these because it's very difficult to get that much lumber in the trenches. You build a firing step here, so it allows you to stand up on here to fire your rifle over the parapet, and your ammunition storage, which goes right here. Your opposing forces are on the other side and on their trench, and they'll look something like this as well. Now, this is a very basic trench. Some of your more complex ones have compartments built into here or over here for storage or for sleeping or for protection. Now, what you get when you have both sides digging in trenches is an aerial view here. You can see the section in between is what's known as no man's land. You have your barbed wire protecting both trenches, you have your frontline trenches and your support trenches. Connecting each is a communication trench, and your commanding officers will be somewhere back here, away from danger. They don't want to be the ones fighting and dying. This is a bit more accurate picture of what the trench life might look like. This is a fairly basic trench, as you can see. It's reinforced with some steel here, and you can notice how wet it is down on the ground. This would not be a particularly nice place, especially in the winter or during the rainy parts of the fall, where it would fill up with water, and the soldiers have to stand in this for as long as they could. Now, supporting the front lines are the supply lines. You can see here these horses are the ones who are bringing up some of the supplies, and these soldiers here are the ones who lead the horses. Each tour of duty within the trenches lasts 12 days. You spend 6 days at the front line fighting and 6 days in the support lines with the supplies. Now, after your 12 days, you get some time off to go back to one of the cities and relax, but then you have to go back to the trench. When you're on duty in the trench, you eat, sleep, live in the trenches. You do not get to leave, you do not get to go home, you do not get to go anywhere. You're stuck there. Not very fun. Also, there are rats. I'm not talking mice, I'm talking rats. Rats big the size of cats and raccoons who would bite the soldiers and chew on their legs while they were sleeping. You weren't allowed to shoot the rats because your officer would yell at you for wasting ammunition. The rats were a huge problem and spread a lot of disease and sickness amongst the trenches. Now, the rats weren't the only problem. A lot of soldiers developed a condition known as trench foot. This is what happens when you spend all your time standing in knee-deep water. What happens is that the feet of the soldiers would sometimes swell 2 to 3 times their original size. This becomes really, really painful, as you can imagine, but even worse when the swelling goes down and you find that some of your flesh is actually rotted away. This poor soldier here can see that some of his toes have actually fallen off. Not a particularly nice condition. Okay, so you can't sit in your trench and just wait for the war to end. At some point, you have to do something. So what happens is that soldiers would get the command that's called going over the top. And when your officer tells you to go over the top, that means you have to run out of your trench, up into no man's land, and across the field to attack the other trench. Now, you might think this is a really bad idea, and I'm not going to go. But if your commanding officer tells you to go and you don't, he'll just shoot you anyway. So you might as well take your chances going across no man's land. Not the best way to fight, not the smartest way to fight, but at some point, as I said, you have to do something. Many soldiers, of course, die even getting out of the trench because the second you stick your head up, the other side knows where you are and they'll shoot at you. Horrible way to fight. Now, if you're lucky enough to live through the day, you still have to deal with the night. Since you don't get to leave your trench, at nighttime your job is to repair any sandbags that need fixing, the barbed wire that's been broken, and basically do whatever you can to make your trench more secure and stay alive. Now, the problem with this is that the other side would at the same time be doing the same things, but they're also sending raiding parties. Raiding parties would travel across no man's land in secret and try to get down to the enemy trench and kill as many soldiers as they can, as quietly as they can. As you can imagine, this is not the safest place, and nighttime was often the worst for the soldiers, especially after a particularly bad battle when you could still hear soldiers in the middle in no man's land dying and crying out for their friends. All in all, trench warfare was a horrible way to fight, and unfortunately it spent most of World War I figuring out that this was not the way to win the war.